tonight's Facebook Live town hall. Tonight, we will be diving into the subject of relief and help for renters and homeowners during the COVID-19 crisis. And I am so pleased to be joined tonight by three terrific panelists. We have Congressman Alan Lowenthal. Thank you so much for being here. We're also joined by Lisa Sitkin from the National Housing Law Project and Anya Lawler from the Western Center for Law and Property. As you know, California has taken truly extraordinary steps to fight COVID-19, and together we are meeting this crisis. Together we are beginning to bend the curve. We do know that California's statewide stay-at-home order is working. We also know that our statewide stay-at-home order has been a tremendous sacrifice for so many Californians. And I'm sure, Congressman, like your office, each and every day, we get phone calls from constituents who say, I don't know how I'm going to pay my bills, don't know how I'm going to pay my mortgage. I'm scared right now. So I'm so pleased that we're able to answer some of your questions tonight. And we've got some questions that came in over email. We'll start with those, and then we'll also be responding to questions that come in on Facebook. I'll just say that if we don't get to your question on the live segment, my office will cycle back with you either through email, if that's how you reached out, or through Facebook Messenger. So with that, I'm going to start with a question that, like I said, we get almost every day, and that's, I can't pay my bills. I'm afraid my house is going to get repossessed. What is the government doing to help me right now? And Congressman, if it's okay, I'd like to start with you on that. If you could share with us the federal perspective on this issue and all the work that you're doing to help homeowners during this time.
Okay, let me give you a little history and where we are right now, Connie. And first, I want to thank you for inviting me to be on the town hall. I know this is because every day, as you point out, all of us, we all have our constituents wondering how are they going to pay their bills, how are they going to keep their housing, what about their jobs? And this is a crisis of unbelievable size. The Congress started, we've now done, well, after this week, we're going to finish up, we will now have dealt with 4 major bills. The first bill was the beginning of March, and that was a bill to try to get as much money as we could to the healthcare facilities, to start the testing, to find out what was the scope of the problem. Then we did a bill to protect families. And we said, you gotta be able to have PIC leave, you have to be able to have family leave. There has to be a way in which we can support families. And then about 2 weeks ago, we did a massive bill which said, all right, everybody is now tremendously impacted by the virus. We're laying off people. We're going to first provide tremendous additional help and extend unemployment tremendously. We're going to say that we're going to expand who is eligible for unemployment. In the past, it was very rigid requirements. Now we're going to do things. Single people have entrepreneurs, gig economy folks, part-time folks. We're going to try to get everybody in. We're going to extend the amount of time that unemployment's there. And we're going to give everybody, in addition to what your state gives you when you apply, because that's a state, we're going to give you $600 a week. Well, there are so many people applying for unemployment because that keeps you whole a little bit. That the systems have been collapsing, and EDD is having a hard time here in our state and in all states trying to deal with the massive numbers. But hang in there. If you're not getting benefits, or call our office or even your office for the state, to find out what is happening. The other thing is we're trying to protect, we're trying to get rid of the virus. That's the first thing. So we're trying to support wonderful Governor Newsom, who has really taken a tremendously positive stand and said, we're all in this together. We're going to do something. We do not want to become another New York. We're going to drive this down. We're going to do whatever we can to stay at home and to protect the most vulnerable. And we're going to make sure that everybody does that. And I'm real proud of it because I spend all my time every day either talking on the Orange County call with the health providers. I'm dealing with Leader Pelosi. I'm dealing with, when we're hearing interactions with Mnuchin. Do we have enough money? And the thing that we did on the original bill, besides the unemployment, was a massive increase in small businesses. And those were businesses up to 500 people. We also helped larger businesses, but the small business especially. And we said that if you keep your employees on the payroll, we'll pay for it. We'll help you tremendously if you keep them. We'll give you a loan, but we'll forgive that loan if you keep those employees on the payroll, and the money goes directly for paycheck protection. We're finding that because that money went out the door. It was the most popular federal program in the history of federal programs. People were applying, and unfortunately, it did not get as much as we wanted to the small businesses in our community, to the nonprofits, to the people who may not have had the resources as some of these larger small businesses. Very important, but we realized as the money went out, we have to protect some of the smaller businesses. And we also realized we gave a tremendous amount of money to hospitals, but we're just learning that we have to be able to move our money quicker and more effectively to the real hot spots, and that's what we're going to try to do. And so that's where we are now. We're going to give additional money to small businesses for the PPP, but we're going to take money out. It's starting this week, about 60 billion of the 300 billion or so that we're giving to and we're going to say that is just for small businesses, just for the businesses that go through their local credit unions and community banks. And we've got to support women-owned businesses that deal with CDFI, community development, financial institutions. So we're going to try to get the money to the smaller banks because we realized we didn't get that money the first time there. And so that's kind of where we are. We know we didn't deal with cities. We tried as hard as we could to deal with it. We're working on a letter right now. We led a letter to Treasury asking Mnuchin to say, like counties like Orange County, which have given a great deal of resources to trying to get the homeless off the streets with Operation, I think it's Turnkey or Key. We want to we want to make sure that those cities and the counties that do things like that get reimbursed right now. Because right now, when you're out, county today received its money we're figuring out what's an allowable expense, and so we're working at that. So there are two issues. One is getting the money there, and then figuring out, getting the guidance out, because all of this is brand new. And so that's where we are right now, and I'm thank you for asking me. That bill, which adds tremendously to the small business, to hospitals, to testing, that will be to the governor by the end of this week.
Well, thank you so much for that overview, and thank you for your leadership.
To the president by the end of this week.
Yes, and thank you for your leadership in what is, like you said, a truly unprecedented crisis. And here in California,
totally.
We're doing everything that we can to provide relief for the families, the workers, and the small businesses who have been so devastated by this global pandemic. And specifically in terms of the relief that we've been able to provide for homeowners here in California, we secured agreement with 4 of the big banks: Wells Fargo, Citigroup, US Bank, and JP Morgan Chase, as well as 200 other small lenders to provide a mortgage relief for a 90-day period to help California homeowners through this period. Lisa, can I ask you to provide us with some of the details of that program and just an overview?
Absolutely. I'm actually going to step back just for a moment, though, because I want to lay the ground and say that we have that state program, but I sort of view it as an extra layer after the federal protections that were provided in the CARES Act, which was signed on March 27th. So specifically for homeowners, I think that's sort of the starting place to know about, and then I'll just talk about the state piece as well. The CARES Act, in a nutshell, for what are called federally backed mortgage loans, which is about 70% of all loans nationally, These are loans that are backed or insured or guaranteed by a government agency, and that includes Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. People may have heard of those. They sort of got famous during the foreclosure crisis, and they're back in the news. In any case, if your loan is in that category, then the federal act gives you the right to contact your mortgage servicer. You always have the right to contact them, but to request mortgage forbearance, which I will define in a moment, for a total of up to 12 months, but it will very likely be in smaller increments before then. And we're seeing that the most likely increment, especially when you first call, is going to be 90 days, and then you can get that extended as you need, and nobody knows exactly how long this is all lasting. So that is provided, and under that federal law, and again, for the federally backed mortgages, in order to get that assistance, you do need to contact your servicer. None of it is automatic, but all you need to provide is your affirmation that you are having a financial hardship due to the COVID pandemic. And that can be directly or indirectly. It doesn't mean you have been diagnosed or something. It's that you are being impacted financially and are going to struggle to make that next payment. You are not supposed to be required to provide any documentation, because at a time like this, it's very hard for the servicers to process that, and very difficult for many people who may not have a fax machine or other technology at home to be transmitting documents. So that was provided for there. So that's the kind of first layer. Now, for people who don't have that protection in that other 30%, which are privately held loans, we do have this agreement that Governor Newsom's administration was able to make with several banks, including a number of state chartered banks. And I provided, I think this will be shared, a link to where on the Department of Business Oversight website you can see which institutions are participating in that. There are details about it. That works a little bit differently. It provided for up to 90 days of forbearance, and I just emphasize up to because you're not guaranteed the 90 days. So if you're getting less than that, it may be because that's just the fine print there, but hopefully people will generally be getting at least 3 months to give that cushion. And then in that instance, in the agreement, there may be some additional documentation required. We're hoping that's not being asked for a lot, but there is a little bit more wiggle room on that for those. So if you don't have a federally backed mortgage, and again, I've provided materials here and a link so you can look that up if you don't know. You may hear some different messages or something from your mortgage servicer. But the important thing is that what people should be getting and should be offered when they call to request help or when they go to the website of their servicer is this thing called a forbearance, which is essentially a pause in your payments. So they say, okay, for this 3 months, if you can make partial payments, that's great, because then you won't build up so much of a amount due at the end. But if you can't, then it will be down to zero, and you will be able to delay making those payments. It's very important to know, though, that these are not being forgiven, they're not being waived. So if you get one of these forbearances, then there's going to be a further process at the back end when that ends to work out how those monies are going to be repaid. And there is, I will just be honest about it, a fair amount of confusion about what that's going to look like, because nothing right now is clearly mandatory. There are a lot of complicated moving pieces. We are hoping to move toward a more consistent, clear kind of model for what that will look like at the back end. But the important thing for people to know is if you can pay your mortgage, even if it's a bit of a stretch, it's much better to do that. This is really, I consider, sort of a last resort. A lot of people need it. A lot of people need this help, but it's important to know that it's still complicated to get and complicated to resolve afterwards. So don't take it lightly. That's
okay. And so just some of the key points for folks then is that it's not automatic. You need to work with your lender to make this happen. but there is not proof or documentation required as long as if you're a Fannie or Freddie customer. There may be for the other folks. It's a forbearance, not a forgiveness. And so how do people figure out then what the terms of the repayment are once the forbearance ends?
So that's sort of the $50 million question, because there are a number of approaches, arrangements that can be made. But because the servicers don't know right now what your financial situation is going to be at the end of the forbearance, some people may be right back on their feet, able to resume payments. That'll be one kind of plan. Other people will not be able to return to where they were financially. So for them, they will need to be reviewed for a full loan modification in the hopes of getting that payment lowered. For people who can afford it at that time, they will be offered the option of simply reinstating, meaning paying a lump sum. That's not going to be most people. And I think one of the concerns people have is a lot of the services are saying on these calls, well, you're going to have to pay it back right at the end. There's a slight risk. They're going to ask for that. But if you can't afford to do that, they should be working with you at that point to work out a plan such as extending your loan terms so that you start making your payments again and then just make up those missed payments later at the end of your loan term. And there are, subtleties to how that can look, but it is going to depend on what's affordable for you and what your circumstances are at the end of the forbearance.
Okay, and we've got a few follow-up questions. Let's see. How long will the temporary payment relief last? Congressman, can I ask you to field that one?
Well, as was pointed out, in the original CARES Act, it had that the forbearance would last for 100 and up to 180 days with an extension of an additional 180 days. So we're really talking about as this goes on. It could be up to 1 year, just about 1 year it was considered. That's how long the forbearance. And remember, it's not just Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac. It's the Federal Housing Administration. It's the Veterans Affairs. It's the Department of Agriculture. There are a large number of federal agencies that either own or back these loans, many of your loans that are out there. And so you need to check with your bank whether you're eligible for it, because the forbearance is longer, and it's correct. The CARES Act did not specify at all how it would be paid back, with the thought that would be worked out, just like in the state, that would be worked out between the lender and the individual. And there's lots of thoughts and differences between different lenders about how to do that. And hopefully that will get resolved as more guidance comes down.
Right. And so, we did get a question of how do I figure out if I'm eligible for help, which I think, Congressman, you did answer, but just I want to make sure that people understand that the first step in all of this is to contact your lender, to understand what you're eligible for, to discuss the terms, and to get an arrangement in place, and to, if at all possible, to do that before you miss a payment. So do that now.
And can I just add?
Yes, please.
The etiquette of this is always, I don't want to interrupt, but I just want to add that as I mentioned, there are some tools where you can, before you contact your lender, look up if you're not sure if you have a federally backed loan and you want to know that going into the phone call, which I think is useful to arm yourself with the information. There are ways to check that in your mortgage documents, or for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, there's an online tool for that. And in the materials and links that are provided, there's one from my organization, NHLP, that has a little sort of chart of how you find that out. So I would say it's very important to reach out to your servicer, but you may want to take a little time first to just educate yourself about what kind of loan you have and what kind of category it's in there.
Okay. All right. So now someone said, my bank told me that they're not offering this assistance. What other resources are available for me and people like me?
sense for me.
Yes.
Okay, go on. Why don't you go?
No, if you'd like to say.
Yeah, Congressman,
No.
you start.
No, I'll wait. Just mine, I think all banks, if you have a federally backed or operated, you will get your money if that's there, that you will be able to go through the federal process. You have to find that out, as was pointed out, and it's so wise to find out before you contact your lender that you have. But your lender, if it's really owned and operated and or been sold to the federal agency or they're managed, you will be eligible for it. And it's a very simple process, extremely simple. You just have to state that you've been impacted by this and demonstrate you've lost your job or something like that. You somehow, and that it's federally backed, and that's it.
And
I would add,
yes, please.
I would just add, I'm sorry, in terms of, where else to go. Unfortunately, I mean, if you don't have a federally backed loan and your servicer is saying this assistance is not offered, I would say that it's important to push back a little bit, because even for non-federally backed loans, most servicers are providing some kind of assistance. And even if they're not doing a 3-month or a 6-month or something, they may do at least 1 month, and then you can call back and get it extended. So I would push back and explore what's possible and whether they would review you for some kind of other option, even a loan modification, depending on kind of what your finances are. But maybe don't take no as your last answer.
Okay. So as you said, do some research up front so you know what you're eligible for going into the conversation, and be willing to push back, and don't take no. Do not take no for an answer the first time. Another question is this going to affect my credit report? And the answer to that is that the forbearance may be listed on your credit report, but that does not damage your credit score. What does damage your credit score is missing a payment. That's why it's so important to reach out to your lender before you miss a payment. I don't know if there's anything either of you would add to that.
I would just say that the CARES Act has a section on credit reporting that actually, some of the experts, and I'm not one on credit reporting, but are a little bit confused because it seems to actually say that they're supposed to suspend reporting. So it may show up as some sort of forbearance, but it may actually just show up as nothing at that point. And so don't be shocked if that's what you see. But the idea is that if you get a forbearance, it should not impact your credit score.
Yeah, let me give the exact language that I am, because you're absolutely right. If you are getting forbearance, and especially on a federal loan, a backed loan, federally managed loan, the CARES Act amends the Fair Credit Reporting Act, and it instructs lenders to report that borrowers are current on their credit obligations when a special payment accommodation, like a forbearance, if you're given a forbearance, is in place specific to the COVID-19, and that's how you get the forbearance. You have to say that this was due to that. The federal law states that you are to be reported as current on your obligation. And the governor also has said the same thing. He has also asked that there be no negative credit reporting for those participating with lenders in California for the non-federally backed. So it doesn't have all the specifics laid out about it, but the intention of the CARES Act was this is not to be a negative to affect your credit rating. Absolutely, if you get forbearance, you are now to be listed as current.
Yes, 100%. And so will I be charged extra fees or other charges if I accept this temporary relief? My understanding is no.
Correct.
Your lender is not supposed to charge you any fees for allowing you to participate in this program or offering you this relief.
Again, when we're talking about the federally backed loan, so it's going to look a little bit different. If you find that you do not have one of those, you should be asking specifically about that on the call. Our hope is that servicers will be waiving any fees they might otherwise have charged, but there's not a requirement and that they, don't do that unless it's federally backed. So that's why that distinction matters for people to know.
Right. And just one other question for you, Lisa. Can my bank foreclose on me and evict me from my house during this emergency?
So currently, under the CARES Act, again, there is a moratorium on foreclosures that expires on May 17th. It was basically a 60-day from mid-March. We are hoping and expecting, given how things are going, that that will be extended. I don't know if the congressman has any insights on whether we can expect that. But again, that only applies to those federally backed loans. So there are people currently not covered by that. Under the agreement that the governor struck with several of the big banks and many state chartered banks, there also is an agreement to hold off for 60 days. And I think that that was in late March as well. So we're looking into May. But I just want to emphasize that there's not a complete consistent across the board moratorium on foreclosures. It's a mostly moratorium right now, and right now it's temporary. There is some activity in the legislature here in California to try to get a stronger and more comprehensive protection for people, and hopefully that will start to move forward when the legislature comes back next month.
Yes, I absolutely anticipate that it will. And Congressman, if you have any insight on what might be coming on the federal side that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think what we can see is that the premise is to protect homeowners and keep them in their homes as they go through, as they lose their revenues, as they lose their jobs, as they're now having to seek out. And I think just as we've seen with the SBA loans, what will happen will not be less protection for homeowners, but we'll look to see if we really are covering everything that we say we are. And so I do not anticipate when we extend this program that we're going to lessen the protections of forbearance or not having any evictions or loss of home. That we're not going to do, but we're going to take a look and see how it's working. As I pointed out with the small business loans, we've now realized that some of the larger banks are giving, as they normally do, are going to the customers, their larger customers, and giving out those loans. And the small customers, the mom and pop, have to wait at the end of the line. Well, we've got to deal with that. And that's what we're trying to fix by having more money go to community banks, that limit the amount of money that the companies have to apply to keep it in those communities. And the same thing will happen here. We're going to look to see as we go to the next stage, how do we make sure we protect those that have been affected by the coronavirus? That's all we're trying to do, is to protect our communities. They had nothing to do with this. And we're making large demands upon them to stay at home. It's the responsibility of the government during these times to help them do that. And that's what we're going to do with the next one also.
Well, and Congressman, I think you've got another.
Get rid of the snags. If we say we're sending them a check, get that check too.
Right, you gotta get it to them. I believe you've got another engagement, but yes. Before you sign off, I want to ask you one last question, because Congressman, you have been serving our community for 28 years in local, state, and federal office. You spent 14 years in the California State Legislature, including during 2008, the Great Recession. I would just love, before you sign off, to get your big picture perspective on the lessons that you learned as a policymaker during those times, and what you see as California's really critical priorities as we weather this crisis and move on to ensure a swift recovery.
Well, even before I was in elected office, or while I was on the city council over 20 years ago, to 35, 40, I taught community psychology at California State University Long Beach. So my whole orientation is listening to my community, understanding how we can prevent problems, that psychology has much more of a role in terms of prevention. Well, 30, 40 years ago, that was not seen as, we waited to treat people and to have people come to us. And I think what we're seeing is now, the first thing is that we have to be far more prepared and deal a lot more and put our money into prevention. That's what we have to protect our small businesses. We have to protect the people who are on the front lines, the community health centers, because they're the ones that are the most vulnerable. They're the ones that are out there helping people who may not have insurance, who need to have help, who are in the communities that have the highest incidence. And we must, we have to deal with homelessness issues. We have to deal with housing issues, not just keeping people in their homes, but getting people into their homes. We have to make sure that we do that, because that will help us prevent things. That will help us with all kinds of illness. That will promote well-being in communities. And I think California's done a great job. It was great when I was in the city council, when I walked my district and people kept telling me as a college professor, why are you doing this? And I'd say, well, this is why I do it. They'd say, well, that's really interesting, Alan. But tell me, what's this black soot in my window? And that's when I began to learn about pollution from the ports, people having to breathe that air, that we really have to prevent and make sure that all communities have access to resources and we don't disproportionately affect communities. So I still think that it's like when you're running for office. I think that's the best thing you can do. It's not being it's walking and talking to people. It's listening to them. I think staying in touch and understanding it's all about being a partner with them and protecting them. And you're just part of that process along the way. And so it's been kind of my life's work, and I'm very, very pleased that I've had this little opportunity to participate and hopefully help my community do better.
Well, thank you for joining us, and thank you for all that you do for your community and for all of us.
Thank you.
Look forward to catching up with you soon.
All right. Thank you.
And we're now going to transition over to, we spent the first part of the conversation focused on relief for homeowners and talking through the programs that are going to help with mortgage relief. We want to move now to some questions that are focused on renters and what we're doing to help and protect renters. So Anya Lawler, I'd like to start with you on this. I lost my job because of the shutdown. Now I can't afford to pay my rent. I'm scared I'm going to get evicted.
So I'm going to talk about a variety of different rules that are in place around evictions, starting with the rule that applies broadly statewide, and then touch on some federal rules and some local rules that might be of interest to some of your constituents. So the most sweeping rule in place in California is the rule that was adopted by the Judicial Council that applies to all 58 superior courts in California, that effectively puts a pause on all evictions in California until 90 days after Governor Newsom lifts the state of emergency related to COVID-19. We don't know when that will be yet, but in all likelihood, that's probably not going to be anytime soon, which means evictions are on pause until at least the fall, if not beyond that. And that rule applies to all evictions. So not just evictions related to non-payment of rent, but any type of eviction is on pause right now, other than evictions that are necessary to protect public health and safety. It was very important that the courts were able to move those types of evictions forward. But all evictions are on pause. And what that means is that landlords can start the initial stages of an eviction. So for instance, if you can't afford to pay your rent, your landlord could still give you what's called a 3-day notice to pay rent or quit. And if you can't pay the rent, which a lot of people are probably not going to be able to do, and that notice expires after 3 days, they can file an eviction. But that's where it stops. And the courts will not move any further on that until 90 days after the state of emergency is lifted. And so tenants don't have to respond in any way at that point. That will all be handled later down the line. So that's kind of what's going on statewide. I will note, though, that once a landlord gives a tenant a 3-day notice to pay rent or quit, and that notice expires, the landlord is at that point under no obligation to accept back rent from the tenant at any point. That obligation is gone. Now, hopefully a lot of landlords are going to be willing to work with their tenants. We imagine many will, but that's just something for people to be aware of, that it's possible that if your landlord does choose to file an eviction now, come the expiration of that judicial council order, even if you have the money to pay the rent, you may still be impacted by an eviction unless those rules change between now and then. And I think that's something on the minds of the legislature right now. In addition to that judicial council rule, there are federal rules in place. So it gets a little confusing. So tenants in some types of properties are protected by even stronger federal rules that prevent a landlord from even taking that first step to file eviction paperwork. And those rules are in place until July 25th. And those are applicable to tenants who live in public housing properties, properties financed through the low-income housing tax credit program, which is going to be most types of deed-restricted affordable housing. It also applies to tenants who live in properties that have a federally backed mortgage. So a mortgage backed by Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, FHA, the VA, things like that. Now, how are you supposed to know if this applies to you? It can be a little challenging. You probably know if you live in public housing. I think you probably know if you live in deed-restricted affordable housing, and it's likely, if that's the case, that it was funded through low-income housing tax credits, but we can give you a link to a website to verify that.
Great.
And then in terms
with everyone.
In terms of properties with federally backed mortgages, that's roughly going to be about 40 to 50% of single family properties in California, and probably about half of multifamily properties. You should ask your landlord to check with their servicer, because the servicer is obligated to let the landlord know who is actually backing that mortgage, and so the landlord can then let you know if your property is covered. And there are national groups working on trying to build a database of those types of properties, but that's a bit of a work in progress. So it can be a little bit challenging, but ask your landlord. Your landlord may already know, and if not, they can try to find out to know whether you're protected by the federal protections. In addition, many, many local governments throughout California have adopted their own local eviction protections. And in Assembly District 74, Laguna Beach and Costa Mesa have both already adopted local ordinances. And these go a little bit further than the court rule and things like that, because they actually say that just with respect to evictions related to non-payment of rent, where the tenant has lost income or had some other financial impact related to COVID, if the tenant notifies the landlord within 30 days of the rent being due, so 30 days after the rent was due, if you notify your landlord that you couldn't pay the rent for that reason, and you provide documentation, and it doesn't specify the type of documentation, just any documentation that would show that you've lost income, lost your job, had reduced hours, had medical expenses, things like that, and you provide that to your landlord, at that point, the landlord cannot proceed with an eviction. And you also get 120 days after the emergency is lifted to pay the back rent. So it can be a little confusing, because what protections you have currently depend on where you live. And so what I would suggest is, number one, you should pay your rent if you can. That is the best way to protect yourself. Just as Lisa said in the mortgage context, the best thing you can possibly do if you can is to pay. This isn't intended as a free-for-all for everyone to simply stop paying their rent, but we know that many people are not going to be able to pay their rent, and we know that that can create a hardship for some landlords. And so if you can't, the best thing to do is communicate with your landlord as soon as you can, retain all of the communications, and start gathering any evidence you might have to prove that you are impacted by COVID.
And so one question, what about evictions that were already happening before these new rules? And my understanding there is that evictions that were already in the court system may in fact proceed, but by virtue of where we are with the state of emergency and the judicial council, their new rules, that has effectively paused any evictions that were in process as well. Is that accurate?
Yes. with a couple of caveats. So if an eviction case had already been set for trial, or even if the tenant had received the summons and responded to the summons and it was in process, those evictions will eventually move forward, but not for at least 60 days. So those are all pushed back at least 60 days, and then we'll see what happens next. And then also, it's not going to get to the point of the sheriff's lockout, which is the last point in an eviction if the the landlord gets the writ of possession. And so those are on pause right now as well. So those will eventually proceed, but right now people should be confident that they're going to remain housed even if they already had an eviction in process.
Yeah, and I think that last point is really what I want people to take away, because I think that sometimes, as we do as lawmakers, we end up with these things that are very complicated. It's kind of the if or buts or all these little subsets. But the goal with all of this policy is to ensure that as we move through this crisis, that people are protected and that no one ends up on the streets over the course of this global pandemic. And that is the absolute goal. And I think that there certainly is more work to do on this, and there's more work that we will be doing on this from the legislature's perspective. Just one of the things that I want to flag for folks listening is that I and a group of legislators are working on the creation of a renters relief fund. So working on legislation and a budget request to support that. Because as we said, at the end of this kind of reprieve, there's going to be a lot of people who have really large rent bills and in many cases aren't going to be able to pay them. And we're going to do everything we can to provide as much relief as we can for people who have been impacted by this. Let me see. So a couple more questions that are coming in I'd love to ask you to field. So I'm a small business owner. Am I protected too?
Yes, so the Judicial Council emergency rules cover those types of evictions as well. So same rules, right? 90 days after the state of emergency is lifted is when courts can start reprocessing evictions. And so until that time, everyone, whether you own a small business or you're a renter, you can be confident that you're going to be able to stay where you are.
And I got one question about timing. So is there any discussion among the legislature and the governor to extend the eviction pause order past May 31st? And I actually want to respond to that because the current rule says that there's this pause on evictions 90 days beyond when the governor lifts the emergency order. So if the emergency order was lifted tomorrow, we would still have an additional 90 days. So it's not expiring on May 31st is what I want people to know.
Right, and I think where that stems from is that the governor passed an executive order that expired on May 31st, but then the Judicial Council acted after that, and their actions effectively overrode that executive order and gave much more time.
Yes, it gave more time and it gave more protections. Yes. So let's see. What should I do if my landlord threatens to evict me despite all these rules?
So I just want to highlight the point that the Assemblywoman just made, which is that your landlord cannot evict you right now because the courts are unable to process those cases and the sheriff is unable to lock you out. And so just be confident that even if your landlord is threatening you, they can't do anything. And what we would recommend in those cases is if you feel like your landlord is threatening you, contact an attorney and get legal assistance. Don't let yourself be coerced into signing anything. It's fine if you want to approach your landlord and negotiate an agreement on back rent, on a rent reduction, things like that. But we would strongly recommend that if you're going to do that, that you get legal assistance to make sure that you're not signing anything that might sign away rights that you don't know you have, or that might override relief that might be coming from the legislature or the federal government. But just be confident that there is nothing your landlord can actually do right now. And if your landlord does lock you out during this time, know that they do not have the right to do that, and that is a crime, and you should contact your police. Now, hopefully nobody will do that, but you should just be aware and just feel confident that for quite a bit of time, you cannot lose your housing.
And I think the good thing is I think the vast majority of landlords and the folks that I talk to are trying really, really hard to do the right thing and do the right thing by their tenants. And they're also finding themselves in a really tough tough spot where they've got a mortgage to pay and tenants that perhaps can't afford to pay their rent. So I did actually want to jump to some questions that we've gotten from landlords. And Lisa, I'm going to start with you. So who's helping the landlords is the question.
It's a good question. I think that there are a combination, a series of kind of policy proposals and things being considered now to try to address that. Some may look like the rental assistance relief that the Assemblywoman was just speaking about at the state level. But there is another round of federal legislation being considered and discussed and chewed over right now that also includes a significant amount of funding, some of which might go directly to tenants, but some of which would go actually to support, for example, low-income housing tax credit owners in buildings where their revenues from the rent have gone way down, to be able to stabilize those. Because those are properties where we've already invested public dollars and we want to be sure they can operate and everything can keep going to have that affordable housing still exist for the long run. So there is attention being paid, but right now I can't point to a specific landlord relief fund that is yet in existence, but stay tuned.
But I think it's important that landlords understand that they do qualify for all of the mortgage relief programs that we talked about at the beginning of our conversation.
Sure. If you have a mortgage, you can certainly contact your servicer and everything. And you know, and then there's going to be that question, as Anya was talking about, with the accrued rent later of, you know, your accrued payments then, and we want to make sure as much as we can that those things line up so that when the landlord has to go back to paying their mortgage, they're getting some income from the tenant or from the government or somewhere to make that possible.
And if applying for this forbearance, will banks and lenders assess your application differently if one application is for a home property and one is for my rental property?
So under the CARES Act, for those federally backed loans, there is not a distinction being made at this time. So you should be able to get the assistance. And I know of one former client of mine who has gotten forbearances on both her home loan for the home where she lives and a rental property where she also has a mortgage, and the forbearances were applied in both cases.
Okay, right. So both your primary residence and any investment property that you rent out are all eligible for those mortgage relief programs that we talked about at the top. Okay, one of my tenants has the COVID-19 virus. Am I now obligated to warn others at my building? Anya, can I ask you to field that?
I can take a crack at it.
Okay.
And I would just say that landlords should not be disclosing medical information about any of their tenants.
Okay. Yes, and you're under no obligation to do so. And in fact, there's privacy laws and guidelines that prohibit sharing medical information with the rest of your tenants. I have a renter now. I'm thinking about selling my house. If I sell my house during this emergency period, is that breaking the law? Lisa, can I ask you to field that one?
Sure. So I don't think it's breaking the law to sell your house. I mean, there are obviously practical impediments to doing home sales now, although I understand some are going on and there are virtual tours and things happening. But if you have a tenant and you anticipate, you know, trying to have them leave, or the new owner is going to try to have them leave, there would be an issue with trying to displace them at this time, given the rules that are in place. So, you know, certainly if you want to sell the house with an existing tenant in it and the new owner is going to continue the tenancy, that should be fine. But if you're looking to displace someone, I think that can be a problem.
Okay. So if you, when you sell the house during this period, it has to be done with the existing tenancy agreement as part of that sale.
It does. And I will say, and Anya knows this better than I probably, but there are also, before COVID and everything that we're going through now, there were certain protections in place for tenants in houses that were sold anyway. So that's something as a landlord, you need to get your arms around at this transitional moment if you're going to sell, to understand what is and is not allowed, not just under crisis conditions, but under the law generally.
Okay. Anya, is there anything you would add to that?
No, I think Lisa covered it very well.
Okay. Let's see. The last question I have on the Facebook is, are there any financial assistance programs that I can tell my residents about? I've got a bunch of tenants that have been laid off and are telling me they can't pay their rent. And so I just wanted to touch on a few of the programs that are available to help everyone during navigate this really incredible crisis. And the Congressman mentioned some of this because some of it is part of the relief that was provided by the CARES Act. But as part of the CARES Act, we have extended unemployment insurance benefits in a couple of ways. So we've increased unemployment insurance by $600 per week for all filers. We've also, under the Pandemic Assistance Program, we have been able to extend unemployment benefits to non-traditional workers, so gig workers and Uber drivers, part-time workers, self-employed folks, contractors are now eligible to receive unemployment benefits. And that program is going to be rolled out and available on April the 28th. So is that, 6 days from now. And while it's going to be available on April 28th, those benefits, you can apply them retroactively. So you can apply those benefits as far back as February 1st if you have a job loss and it's related to the COVID-19 pandemic. The other thing I would highlight is that California has paid family leave programs that are available that people should be aware of. And we also have food assistance programs. And to find out more about that, you can look up CalFresh. So you Google CalFresh, and that's the best way to find out that information. The income thresholds to receive CalFresh, which is California's food assistance program, it's about $2,000 a month for a single person and around $4,300 a month for a family of four. So there are a number of programs that are available to help all of our constituents in our communities make it through this very difficult period. There are also a number of short-term rental assistance programs that I wanted to flag for folks, and then I'd love you to add on anything that I may have missed. So the Salvation Army offers special one-time assistance to help pay your rent. Catholic Charities has emergency assistant grants that can help pay rent as well. And Modest Needs is a program that provides a one-time self-sufficiency grant of $1,000 to cover an emergency expense. And I guess last resource I want to make sure that people have, because I feel like when we go through these town halls, we get so much incredible good information from the experts that we're able to bring. But it's always very clear to me that these programs can be really tough to navigate and sometimes just really overwhelming, the amount of information that gets thrown at people. So if you are struggling to pay your rent, if you want us to help connect you with resources in the community, that is why I'm here. That is why my team is here. So please do not hesitate to call our office. My office number is 949-251-0074, and we can help you navigate the rental and mortgage programs that we described tonight, and we can help connect you with resources and help during this time. I would love for both of you just to share any resources or other things that you want to make sure people have before we wrap up tonight's town hall.
Anya?
I am happy to share some resources with your office that they might not already have that can help connect tenants with information and resources and potential legal assistance if they qualify. And I'll just say again that, you know, please pay your rent if you can, but if you can't, be assured that you're not going to get evicted anytime soon. And we know that, you know, a lot of people are very worried because they know they're never going to be able to make up that back rent, but that's going to be a high priority issue. I know, as the member said, when the legislature comes back in May, and it's also a very high priority issue at the federal level. And so we do anticipate that things will change and some relief will come for both tenants and landlords to ensure that, you know, all of that back rent owed doesn't sink both tenants and landlords at the same time, which isn't going to be good for anybody. So appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to your constituents today.
Thank you so much for joining us.
And I would just say thank you for having me, first of all. I think it's great that there's so much outreach and effort to provide information to folks. I did provide your office with a few resources specifically for homeowners. And I just wanted to reiterate that the first one on that list, I don't know if it'll come up that way when you distribute it, but is for my organization, National Housing Law Project, NHLP.org. We have a whole bunch of COVID resources. A lot of it is geared toward tenant advocates. Tenants are themselves are welcome to come there and look. Homeowners, there is a section for them, and I have provided a link to that summary of some of more details of the programs that we talked about. And also, as I said, a way to sort of a little toolbox for how you can look up what type of loan you have, which matters given what the lay of the land is right now. Thank you.
Well, thank you both for being here. And I did want to just touch on one subject that my office has been getting a number of phone calls and emails about, which is a bill that's being discussed, AB 828. And I will just share that I am not a supporter of this bill as it's currently drafted. I think we need to make sure that as we work to provide relief for renters here in California, which we are absolutely committed to doing, that we ensure that we do not create an unintended consequence and an unfair burden on landlords, which then puts them in an equally, if not worse, position. So that is why, instead of a framework that AB 828 is proposing, I'm working on the creation of a renters relief fund that would be supported by state budget funding, and that is the way that I believe we need to provide relief for renters and also support for landlords to ensure that we get through this crisis. And we can and we will get through this crisis together. Be safe, stay home, and stay strong. Thank you so much. Look forward to catching up with you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.